Center for Climate Change Law at Columbia Law School. And we actually owe today's subject matter to his observation that there are people who would like an explanation of how to start climate contracting. So thank you, Michael. We also have with us Cathy DeFiglia, who is Vice President of Practical Law's Global Editorial Team, John Perkins, who is Senior Corporate Counsel at Salesforce, and Jillian Kirn, an Environmental and Energy Law Attorney at Greenberg, Traurig, and Kenneth Rivlin, Partner and Founder of Allen & Overy's US Environmental Law Group. So welcome to you all. I'd like to start, if I may, by inviting each of you to say a few words about your journey to climate contracting and how your organisation has become involved with climate clauses. So perhaps if I could start with Michael.
Thanks very much, Becky. So in 2019, the Environmental Law Institute published a book that John Dernbach and I had edited called Legal Pathways to Deep Decarbonization of the United States. It had more than 1,000 recommendations for federal, state, and local action to fight climate change. After it was published, we decided the next step was to compile and prepare model laws to implement the recommendations in that book. We have assembled a team of about 36 law firms, all working pro bono to draft these model laws. We've set up a website to post them. They're widely available to anybody who wants them. But it also became apparent that model laws are one way to move in the direction of decarbonizing the society. But an additional way is for transactions to include provisions, contractual provisions concerning the positive actions on climate change. And so we were happy to cooperate with Chancery Lane in that effort. We post on our website many of the model clauses that Chancery Lane has adopted. I'll send around in the chat the link to the website. And many of the law firms that are working on drafting the model laws might also be interested in drafting these clauses, and many more will be as well. If anybody who's listening might be interested in more information on our model laws project, let me know. We'd be happy to sign up to you. But these are two parallel, completely cooperative efforts to enlist pro bono lawyers to advance the cause of fighting climate change in their own legal work.
Thank you so much, Michael. Cathy, could I turn to you, please?
Sure. Well, and Becky, I don't think you asked this question with me to start with my admiration for you, but from the practical law perspective, we came to partner with TCLP because of your passion and enthusiasm for lawyers as agents of change in this space, and working closely with the project on where we could incorporate climate change conscious clauses in drafting, just as Michael was talking about. And because of the work that we do at Practical Law in the know-how space, it's a natural partnership that we've enjoyed over the years. So I think in addition to supporting you when you were an editor with Practical Law, supporting other editors who had an interest in the topic personally, and who wanted to use their pro bono time to further the cause of TCLP, and then has expanded to TR in 2020, sponsoring the Big Hack, which was a virtual 24-hour global event where lawyers could come together to identify potential clauses and later develop those clauses, as well as identify existing clauses in the UK that could be adapted in other jurisdictions. And so from there, I think it's just continued, the relationship has continued to grow, and the interest in climate conscious drafting has continued to grow with our organization, with lawyers in the US generally. So we've spent something like 225 volunteer hours partnering with TCLP in 2021, and we have ongoing support of different projects, including providing commentary and feedback on clauses, identifying clauses, and taking existing clauses from that TCLP has and incorporating them into our resources. So it started with you, Becky, so I have to give credit where credit is due, and others at Practical Law have picked up the mantle. So great, I'm delighted to be here.
Thanks, Cathy. They certainly have. It's been amazing to see how the project has taken off this year. If I could turn now to Ken, could you just tell us a bit about your journey to climate contracting?
Sure. Well, first of all, I and my firm are part of Professor Gerrard's army. So we've contributed to his various publications and are looking forward to continuing to. On this particular topic, I mean, we're seeing, as many of the other lawyers on the call will, are seeing, you know, a increasing demand for clauses that deal with climate and other broader issues around ESG in M&A, in all sorts of financings, not just project financings, but all sorts of fundraisings for companies in real estate deals. And so we're increasingly seeing demand for this. I would say there is more of a demand in Europe than there has been in the US, but this is a moving target. And so we have drafted some of our own precedent, and you guys have been doing great work. And so we're really excited about partnering with you, which is, you know, why I'm here with you today. And I think that all of us who are kind of in the transactional space are going to see increasing demand for making sure that we're getting this language right, because it's going to be litigated at some point. And so making sure we understand, you know, what kinds of commitments parties are making, that they understand them, that they're verifiable, and then what the remedies are for their breach is going to be a key issue. And I think that's why, one of the reasons why the project that you guys are embarked on putting together climate related contract clauses that work is so important. So anyway, I'm delighted to be here.
Thank you so much, Ken. I think you're definitely right. If we are moving into the US, I think nothing is surer than litigation will follow at some point. Jillian, if I could turn to you now for your thoughts.
Yeah, so we can all count on death, taxes, and litigation in the US. As Becky mentioned, I'm a shareholder in the environmental and energy practice at Greenberg Traurig, and I'm also currently on a 2-year sabbatical in Stockholm, Sweden, where I work at Climate Change Council. So climate change is near and dear to my heart. And I had the wonderful opportunity of starting to work with TCLP a couple of years ago, helping to draft model clauses related to climate change, particularly as it pertains to water and water use management and extreme weather event preparedness. I think that what TCLP does is something that really resonates in my practice, where I do litigation, but also a lot of transactional and compliance work. And I think one of the things that's been challenging as sort of a corporate lawyer within this space is that environmental lawyers often come to the table a bit too late in the negotiations. And so one of the things that's fantastic about TCLP and the opportunity to kind of get in on this now and early is being able to join that conversation and help make clauses that work. We want to make sure that we have things that are really functional, and the more participation we have, the more likely that is to occur. So I'm really thrilled to be here today.
Thanks, Jillian. As a former environmental lawyer, I can say that coming late to the table has always been a problem for the environment, but hopefully we're fixing that now. If I could turn to John for your thoughts.
Hi, Becky, thanks so much. So I guess really 2 phases. Phase 1 is I had a previous career in technology, and then when I switched to law, my focus was on renewable energy. Fast forward, and I was able to parlay that into leading sustainability legal at Salesforce. And that, of course, is where we began to overlap with your team. So we have introduced the sustainability exhibit to apply sustainability across our supply chain. And in the course of our research, we came across your organization. Fantastically helpful. We certainly integrated some of your concepts into our agreement. We expect to continue to do so across other areas of law.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. So I think now is a really good time to dive into our first question. I wanted to talk to you all about why climate contracting is so important. I think we've covered a little bit of that, but why should organizations start adopting it? Why should they do so now as opposed to, waiting? Michael, if I could perhaps come back to you, that would be really great to hear what you think.
Sure. So there are basically 4 pillars in decarbonizing. The first, and I'm going to tie that into your question in a minute. The first is decarbonizing the electricity supply, moving away from fossil fuels, especially coal, to generate electricity, and having a massive build out of wind and solar and storage and transmission and everything else that's necessary. The second is to increase energy efficiency, the efficiency of energy use, so that we don't use more of it than we need. The third is electrifying those current uses that now use fossil fuels, led by motor vehicles, and also building, heating, water heating, and so forth. The fourth is carbon capture, both from waste streams and from the atmosphere. The fourth one is not yet at a stage where many companies are involved in it, but the first three all are. And as companies enter into all kinds of transactional agreements, it is possible, and it is now, for the sake of the planet, necessary to focus on trying to buy clean electricity, to have as much energy efficiency as possible, to convert to electricity for most uses, and all the other things that are necessary to move away from fossil fuels and slash greenhouse gas emissions. A major way to do that for businesses is to enter into contractual provisions that require that in many of their activities.
Thanks, Michael. I mean, I think one of the things we've always stressed at TCLP is that there's a real need to act now, and that we don't need to wait for regulation. And it seems to me that what you're saying is that there's existing technology, we have a problem now. So contracting provides the sort of perfect nexus to take action. Ken, I'd like to bring you in here, if I may. You touched on litigation and what could be coming down the tracks. Perhaps you could sort of develop that out with the thought process of why it's important to start climate contracting now.
Sure. Well, I mean, there's just increasingly heavy demand for it because climate related, really, I should say, assets or liabilities and transactions need to be taken into account. So, and you see this, first of all, we're doing a number of carbon capture transactions and projects themselves, the fourth pillar that Professor Gerrard mentioned. And so kind of having contracts that kind of spell out what happens, how those carbon reductions are measured, how they're verified, whether there are credits or other assets or values that can be assigned to those reductions is a critical part of the value in those transactions. But equally in, really plain vanilla loans and financing arrangements where there is also our KPIs around climate, then there has to be a way of measuring, verifying, identifying, assigning value, and then providing for disputes in the event that either the credits are not actually generated as promised, or the project's delayed, or other issues go to performance and value. We're seeing increasingly, although I would say it's just beginning, I'd be interested if folks in the audience have a different view, but all sorts of M&A transactions, real estate transactions, transactions where, for example, energy efficiency is being promised based on new construction, transactions where a new investment in a plant is intended to be reducing carbon or having offset projects. How are those measured? How are those adopted? We're increasingly seeing that. And what's interesting is that, and again, I mentioned this at the outset, why your project's so important. There really isn't necessarily a standard yet for these provisions. First of all, the issues are coming up differently in all these deals. And so it's hard to really have a one size fits all approach. And secondly, folks are coming to it differently at different times and different paces. And so, not everyone's here yet. We are on this call, but I don't think the transactional markets are yet. And so it's very exciting, I think, to see. Be interesting to do this call again in 2 years or 3, or even next year, and see how far the market has moved.
Absolutely. We actually did a very similar thing with London Climate Action Week earlier this year, where we did a sort of State of the Union, obviously without the US this time, but just trying to sort of capture the mood and how things were changing. And I think we've seen a real shift in contracting market norms, which is reflected in the amount of content, for example, on Practical Law and also LexisNexis, that references climate contracting and our clauses in particular. I'd like to sort of bring our thoughts now to a quote that John Kerry made last year. He said when he was speaking to the American Bar Association, "You're all climate lawyers now." And I think I'm just sort of thinking back to what Jillian said in the introduction, that often environmental lawyers were sort of late to the party, and climate was very much seen as something that was just another thing that those kind of annoying environmental lawyers would use to scupper a deal. I think we're sort of beyond that now. Jillian, I'm sure you've got thoughts on that.
Yeah, definitely. environmental lawyers often thought of as deal killers, but we are all climate lawyers now. And I think that there are a couple of things that are really important to keep in mind from my perspective. One is that if you look at the FEMA or the Federal Emergency Management Agency's mapping of the US, there is nowhere in the US that is immune from extreme weather events. So whether you're talking about wildfires or flooding or hurricanes or tornadoes or earthquakes, like there's a laundry list, and we can anticipate that climate change is not solely about carbon capture, but also about human impacts, and thinking about how contracts can not only capture the opportunities related to climate from an emissions standpoint, but also think about overall preparedness. And then additionally, I would say that there are two other ways to keep this in mind. One is thinking about the past and the future. So legacy liabilities, think about all of the stuff that might have been that we haven't cleaned up well, because there's always that, while also keeping an eye on the future. And then additionally, becoming a climate lawyer to me means thinking about human impacts, air, waste, and water. And that's kind of like, if you're going into a contract, are there terms that are covering those areas? And not just from a traditional environmental standpoint, but also from a climate forward-looking extreme weather event preparedness perspective.
Thank you so much. That's something we've certainly been thinking of at TCLP this summer. We've, in the context with the backdrop of the terrible droughts and heat waves and fires that we've seen, we've been thinking about just transitional elements as well, and how to weave those in. So it is very much a people thing as well as an environment thing. Perhaps I could also turn to Ken as well. What do you think lawyers should be doing to prepare themselves to become climate lawyers? What are you doing in your practice?
Well, it's a really interesting question, Becky. I mean, I and a number of us have been doing this our whole career. It just wasn't called ESG, and suddenly all these folks are popping up left and right of us, as ESG experts. But the fact of the matter is, kind of building on Jillian's point, these issues are so pervasive that really any lawyer that's doing a deal or advising a client on a whole range of business decisions has to take climate into account. And if not climate specifically, then many of the broader ESG concerns around DE&I and supply chain sustainability, et cetera, that are impacting global businesses. So, it really is critical that any lawyer that's advising any company or government or NGO on issues of risk or liability, or just how best to proceed, has to be taking these issues into account. So there has to be a certain basic level of fluency in this. Is everyone going to be an expert? No. Hopefully there's still going to be room for us environmental lawyers to get paid to provide some legal advice beyond just litigating. But I think everyone has to be fluent in that. So, John Kerry's quote on, you're all climate lawyers now, I think really is true, but I'd probably broaden that to say you're all ESG lawyers now. I do think there's just no doubt about it. And just last thing I'd say is, it really is an exciting time. There's been waves of environmental lawyers, the ones that were born in the 70s and the 80s around the creation of NEPA, and then CERCLA, and then those of us who came of age when I did, when CERCLA was the hot issue before the internet. And we kind of went into the doldrums until now, and I feel like our ship's come in. So we should be taking full advantage.
Absolutely. And funnily enough, one of the sort of interesting things that was on my reading list for the weekend was an opinion by a very eminent King's Counsel here about what lawyers needed to be doing in terms of advising their clients, what elements of climate they should be incorporating into their advice. So I think the debate is well and truly hotting up, as you say. I'd like to turn now, though, to the sort of practicalities of what it means to be taking your first steps on a net zero journey in climate contracting. And I'd like to invite John to tell us a little bit about Salesforce's first steps. How did you begin the journey at Salesforce, and how did our resources at TCLP help you navigate this new territory?
Absolutely. So the very first step, and I would recommend this to any company, is to line up the leadership. We worked with our government affairs team, our executive leadership, philanthropy, obviously our sustainability team, all of the stakeholders, finance, of course, as well. all of our stakeholders were involved at the highest levels to make sure that we would be aligned and that would be supporting this going forward, because we knew this was going to generate deal friction. We knew this was going to be something that we would have to really stand behind. Otherwise, it could just fall by the wayside, be easily conceded, et cetera. So the absolute first step was to collect all of the leadership stakeholders. Once we identified these stakeholders, we really had to focus on what do we want to achieve as a company and why. And of course, this will be different for every company, but we were looking at things like our public-facing commitments, the UN Global Compact, other similar commitments we've made. We looked at our values as a company, the ones that we make our decisions by. And so with this information, we developed our ultimate goals. And for us, that included science-based targets for our supply chain and really reducing emissions across our supply chain, which was such a major, as with most companies, such a major source of our footprint. So once we established what we wanted to do, and once we had the backing of our leadership, then of course it was up to my team to put this into action. And we were very happy in the course of our research to come across TCLP's materials, which are hugely helpful. And to anyone on the call who may not have looked at them yet, what I love about them is they really are, they're excellent for showing you what could be, and then they give you the structure that you need to then refine it to your actual needs. So even though you may see a TCLP provision that's not going to be verbatim what you use, the concept will be useful. The remedies they might apply will be useful. Other things will spark very useful ideas for your personal contracting. And so we ended up doing just that with some of your provisions, and you'll see them now in our sustainability exhibit.
Thank you, John. So really, it's not just a question of throwing a few extra words in a contract. There is actually a process that you need to stack up for success and set yourself up to ensure that it doesn't, as you say, fall through the wayside. So it sounds to me that it's as much about people management as about law, actually. I
agree. I think it's essential to be successful.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And turning to you now, Cathy. You've heard the need from people like Salesforce and obviously Ken and Jillian as well. What are know-how providers doing to prepare lawyers for climate contracting? I know you have a brilliant integration project of Practical Law, and we've seen over the last year how much more of your resources have covered certainly TCLPs and other climate contracting initiatives. So perhaps you could tell us a bit about that.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think first of all, know-how services like Practical Law and others, are designed to help lawyers get up to speed quickly in an area they may not know very well, or, help them mitigate risks in areas that they practice in by keeping up to date with law and practice and regulations. And so I think the marriage between TCLP and what Practical Law does is brilliant, right? It takes all of the thought and the aspirations of what you and your team are doing, and we then take that information and infuse it into our guidance, which is relied upon by lawyers who maybe don't know that they're supposed to be environmental lawyers, right? Everyone has to be, but maybe they're not sure how it applies to them. And so we've undertaken a massive project to take the clauses, and I don't know if I'll get the number right. You can correct me, upwards of 120 now. And our team, I think, had involvement in a fair amount of them, at least in identifying or in giving comment and feedback. And taking those and integrating them in our massive volume of know-how content so that it is available at the time of need in the guidance, whether it be in a practice note to explain a concept or in a standard document that walks you through contracting, including climate conscious provisions. So I think it's a sort of the wide reach of Practical Law helps us expand not only in practice areas that maybe don't come to mind right away, like litigation, and how to have green protocols in a discovery or something along those lines, and then expanded, of course, across jurisdictions, because we are, creating content globally now and allowing contracting that goes on globally to reflect that need. So I think we have TCLP clauses in almost 200 of our resources, and it's growing.
Yeah, it's been absolutely amazing to see. And I know that there have been a number of Practical Law editors around the world who've been involved in some of the peer review processes that we operate at TCLP. And I think what's really nice is obviously we're a small team and we can't sort of provide the kind of chapter and verse, as you say, the guidance around that. So where possible, we link out certainly to Practical Law and also to LexisNexis content as well, to make sure that we're directing people back to the resources that will help them, because obviously we just can't provide that level of expertise and skill and knowledge. So it's an amazing partnership, as you said before. So here we are with kind of know-how providers on board. We've got lawyers sort of knowing they need to do something about climate. So now let's get down to the nitty-gritty. What are the first steps? John's given us some helpful pointers, but I think what I'm hoping to explore now is just to dig down. People who are listening to this call, what should they be doing when they get off the call, before they do anything else? What should they be doing? Michael, perhaps I can come back to you.
So I think getting the leadership on board is very helpful. With our model laws for deep decarbonization project, we have a broad array of model laws that we need to be drafted. And when people contact us, we share a list with them of the model laws that we need and see what they're interested in. One issue that has often arisen as a potential obstacle is conflicts, whether working on this would pose a conflict with any of the firm's clients. What we've found has worked quite well is people just stay away from drafting model clauses or model laws, in our case, that would be a problem for any of their clients. So we have a number of recommendations on standards for motor vehicles, but if a firm is representing motor vehicle manufacturers that might not like those, that's just not what they work on. They work on energy efficiency in buildings or something completely different. And we also give firms and individuals the option of participating anonymously, so that their names aren't posted if their firms don't want them to do that. So Becky, I think it would, so this has turned out not to be much of an obstacle. And Becky, I think it'd be useful for people to hear how they can sign up to do drafting on, individual clauses. I talked about with the model laws, but with your contractual clauses.
Absolutely. I'll ask one of the team here to perhaps put a link to our pro bono opportunities board. But I'm thinking also very practically about the lawyers who are sitting out there in terms of what do they do to transform their practices and make sure that they are avoiding the litigation that Ken spoke about. Ken, perhaps we can bring you in here and just tell us a bit about how you think they can start getting themselves up to speed with climate contracting, and how they can start protecting themselves against the sort of increasing possibility of litigation.
Well, if anyone knows how to protect themselves, could you call me after this? Because I could use some
Okay.
protection. I mean, look, litigation is going to be inevitable, and many of you will recall around EU ETS when it was, hot years ago and getting hot again. I suppose there were all sorts of litigation around the kind of viability of emission reduction credits, and so I think we're going to see that again. Our kind of big picture approach to that is to scenario plan, right? You have a deal done, you imagine a scenario where, a carbon capture project is delayed, or the technology doesn't work, or they don't get a permit they were supposed to get, or they don't get the land they needed to put in a piece of equipment that they needed to get this deal done. And so they can't generate the credits for whatever reason, or they're not viable, or the storage doesn't work, right? And actually carbon's emitted. Let's just imagine scenarios. Then you look at the language and you think it through, does it work or not? You can't protect for everything. And the fact is, a lot of this is so new that we might not even be aware of the scenarios to plan for, right? And so, very big picture and very kind of common sense oriented, that's the way we approach it. There is a lot of experience around kind of regulatory uncertainty, around viability of credits, around credit value. I mean, sometimes some of these provisions may actually go to, what's the price of carbon? And so kind of having provisions that deal with that uncertainty is something to think about, but it's pretty complex. So it's going to depend on the matter, right? And then the other thing that we are doing is making sure we've thought through related dispute resolution provisions, so that if there is a dispute, which jurisdiction and whether it's going to be in arbitration, mediation, or in court, depending on who you represent, where you want that to go. So kind of, Becky, big picture, that's kind of where we're thinking about. And I suppose one thing to consider in a future session would be to, go through particular provisions or a scenario on particular issues or particular kinds of projects, and then have folks, there's such a diversity of experience on this call, even not just from environmental lawyers, but deal lawyers, and maybe have some workshops on particular issues to come up with maybe a best practice.
That's certainly some of the things we sort of tackle in our own internal events when the TCLP runs, and that there will be an event schedule later this year. So I do encourage people to sort of keep an eye on our website. John, can I turn to you, because I'm sort of thinking back to the practicalities. You've got very specific needs in terms of external advice that you might have when you're perhaps looking to your panel law firms to help you out on the work that you're doing. What kind of practices and what kind of work would you expect them to have done to make, and how would you be assessing that they were actually upskilled and ready to start climate contracting with you?
That's a really good question. So most of our outside counsel work we do with very, very niche topics. So we're looking for experience that they have maybe in a particular jurisdiction or maybe in a particular particularly emerging subject matter. When it comes to contracting itself, we take a lot of that in-house. And we do this principally with training both our legal teams and our other teams. It occurred to me in the course of this conversation that, as we were talking about, every lawyer is now a sustainability lawyer, which of course I agree with. One thing we've been saying to our teams is every professional is a sustainability professional. So we take the value from what your organization provides and from what we glean from our outside counsel, and we develop internal training materials to really help our employees understand what our sustainability goals are, why they are, and then how to integrate them into our agreements. So I love our outside counsel, but I say when it comes to contracting, it's mostly an in-house effort.
Yeah, I think I certainly do see that, and we have been working with a number of in-house counsel to understand the processes they're going through, and what we do see is very similar to what you described earlier in terms of that sort of review of the areas, the risks that they might be facing, and then a sort of review of TCLP's content, and then trying to bring the two together and understand how the clauses might be used. And very often that involves setting up working groups to review precedents, or add in wording that can be inspired by our clauses in the way that you had done. So there is a certain amount of upskilling, but obviously we've tried to make the clauses as easy to dive into as possible. But certainly sort of in-house training and review seems to be a very good starting point. I'd like to turn now, if I may, to potential roadblocks. So one of the things we've sort of tackled in some of our events earlier this year was the kind of issues that lawyers might face when they're trying to include these kind of clauses, perhaps when they talk to their clients, and how they might overcome those. What might their negotiating tactics be? How would they introduce these ideas to a client? Jillian, can I turn to you now, and perhaps you could give us some tips on the kind of conversations that you've been having with clients about how to tackle climate and how to get these issues into their contracts?
Yeah, of course. So I think the first roadblock is kind of yourself, insofar as please don't just try to Google this. So you might need a little bit more either experience, specialty related to engineering, math, or science, or maybe you need outside counsel, or perhaps you need some other sort of specialist. And sourcing a good team, both in leadership, as John has sort of referred to, but also to know what you don't know, really sets you up for better success in any sort of transaction. And then the other two sort of roadblocks to getting this sort of successfully rolled out that I've seen for my clients has to do with time and money. So there can be concerns that by incorporating new terms into a contract, that's going to slow things down, or it's going to be more costly. But I think that I've had some success in talking to clients about the fact that, in fact, time can actually be improved by including these clauses, especially if they are throughout your regularly used contracts. Or you may find yourself speaking to an agency, and by having that, it helps to expedite your permitting process, and the deal can close sooner than you anticipated because of having this sort of forward-looking plan. And then additionally, there's the money aspect. There's the avoided cost aspect of litigation, of saying, well, if we have strong clauses and we have a good understanding of what happens with arbitration, let's say, and that we're in a better position to leverage that on this deal and avoid issues in the future. But there can also be large opportunities that you can take advantage of, whether that's related to financing or grants that might be available for a project that has this sort of contracting, as opposed to what has been a bit more historically common. And additionally, while it's not protection from everything, it could be a good time to consider insurance, particularly environmental insurance, because there are certain things that can be covered by environmental insurance provisions that can help to make a deal more attractive and avoid potential risks down the road that are easier to get if you have the right clauses. Now, that's not a fit for everything, but it's the type of thing that might help you get over the hump if you're making the pitch of saying we need climate clauses in this particular contract or across our contracts through an organization.
Sure, well, thanks for that, Jillian. Michael, can I turn to you? Do you have any thoughts on how lawyers might get over those roadblocks? How to start those kind of those conversations with clients, or indeed internally? How do you start presenting these issues?
Well, I think one thing that people need to focus on is that many transactions deal with physical properties, and the circumstances of those physical properties may be a whole lot different in 20 or 30 or 40 years. And that ought to be recognized. One peril that people sometimes rely on, fall into, is excessive reliance on the FEMA flood maps. But the FEMA flood maps are exclusively backward looking. They look at historical floods. They are beginning a process to have future flood projections to reflect what's happening with climate change, but they don't yet. And so it's important for anybody engaged in a transaction concerning real property to look at places. The First Street Foundation is a nonprofit that posts a lot of this. There are other places to try to anticipate what the environment of the particular location might be at the end of the useful life of the project, or the end of the mortgage, or something like that. And I think getting into that conversation is also a good way to have clients think about the climate implications of what they're doing. It's not only floods, it's wildfires, it's lots of other things that are happening. But the physical risks of climate change are actually happening a lot faster than most of the climate scientists had anticipated. And so it's quite important that clients of all kinds who are involved in physical properties, either owning them or building them or financing them or whatever, be very conscious of the climate risks. While they're building projects, if it's a new project, that is also the time to think about the energy efficiency of the project, its energy sources. Is it going to be able to electrify and move away from fossil fuels? Is it going to be conducive to electric vehicles and bicycles? There's a whole range of things that companies can do when they're planning facilities, both to prepare for the physical impacts of climate change and to reduce the impacts they will have on the climate.
Thank you. So really what it seems to me is that there's that sort of stretch in terms of people's timeframes. Jillian spoke about the sort of the need to focus on timeframes, but actually the timeframes that we're used to thinking about maybe are too short, and we need to sort of stretch our horizons and start forecasting better into the future. Interestingly, there's a couple of the sort of major environmental search providers in the UK have recently launched or are about to launch products that do that kind of climate risk forecasting for you. And I think that it's going to be really interesting to see what the uptake is on those products over the next sort of year or so. Ken, I've sort of thought it would be really nice to bring you in here as well to see if there are any roadblocks that you have encountered in your practice and the conversations that you've had with your clients about introducing climate wording, and perhaps you can tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, I don't know if I think about it as roadblocks. I mean, I think that there's an evolving recognition of key risks that particular projects or ventures or transactions could pose along the lines that Professor Gerrard just mentioned. So for example, if you're going to buy or finance a company and they have one key factory in a low-lying coastal area, what happens if there's flooding or some kind of historic storm? You know, are there going to be stipulated damages if they can't fulfill their contracts? Equally is the same kind of issue through the supply chain. So kind of diligence on those issues and then contractual provisions that deal with that risk, at least backstopping the diligence is key, right? And so equally a bank financing a deal that involves one such facility may not want to take security on that particular property or may want some other protections around that. So I think depending on the level of diligence, the timing of a deal, the nature of the parties, where it's located, then, you know, we see clients increasingly thinking, well, okay, thanks for that diligence. How do we translate that into contractual provisions that actually mean something? And that's really the trick. And so I don't know if you call it a roadblock, but the more that we see real risk, which we all are seeing, then there's going to be a need to try to allocate that contractually. And the last thing I just add is that, you know, many of our clients, kind of led by some of the key private equity firms, but not only, are specifically doing ESG due diligence that incorporates climate, right? And so, you know, at the end of the due diligence period, you have your normal DD report, and then there's a separate, typically environmental consultant report, and then there's an ESG report that we or someone else provides. And then the question becomes, how do you translate that into contractual provisions that work? And I still think we're early days, but as we get there, and as, you know, particularly climate risk, but other kinds of risk kind of rear their head. For example, you know, if you have a company that's made a buyer that's made net zero commitments, and they're going to make a big acquisition, and the target that they're acquiring is way behind on that, or they're dependent on coal, or they, you know, or they've already made changes and they're not really going to be enough, then maybe the buyer needs to think about what they do to their overall commitments. And especially if you're a public company and you're potentially subject to the new coming SEC requirements or kind of parallel requirements in Europe or elsewhere, then you really need to think about that from a liability perspective. So I guess to sum up, I mean, there's a lot of moving parts. We're not there yet, but so the roadblock would just be, you know, kind of the evolving but not yet firmed consensus that we need to do something about it. But once that evaporates, then you're going to see more and more of this.
Absolutely. And in thinking about the due diligence, I really like what you said about that. There's a couple of really nice due diligence clauses that we have that people can use to adapt the due diligence they do to take account of climate issues. And perhaps we can drop those in the chat later on. I'd like to turn now to what people on the call can do in terms of getting involved with the US work on adapting TCLP's clauses to be relevant in the US, because our vision at TCLP is a world where every single contract around the world enables solutions to the climate crisis. So we need to scale up our impact around the world, and we need to build a movement of climate savvy lawyers across the globe. And we have lots of teams around the world doing that. And I'd like to invite now two members of the US team, the US adaptation team, to tell us a little bit about what they've done and how people can get involved. So I'm going to hand over now to Ollie and Maddie.
Thanks, Becky. That was very helpful and incredibly insightful. Thanks everyone on all the panelists. That was really, really useful. So as Becky alluded to, we are sort of the early stages of the US. Here's this. Thanks, Hamza. So the US adaptations team. Originally, it's called the adaptations team because we have a sort of critical mass of clauses in England, and original idea was to sort of adapt these to be US focused, as a number of other jurisdictions are doing around the world. We are sort of going a little bit beyond this, and part of that is this initial event, and I'll talk a bit about that later. Next slide, please. So the teams are pretty small ones so far. We have Brandon and Roger at the Practical Law, Stephanie, who's kind of acting as a project manager at Triple Lift, and then myself and Maddie in New York, and Maddie's in San Francisco, sort of leading it. So we're trying to build out as much as the group as possible, and there'll be some information. It's in the chat, but also I'll talk a bit about how you can get involved later. Next slide, please. So this is where we are today in the UK. We have at 119 model clauses. There might be even more now because this is constantly evolving. A huge number of involvement in terms of professional collaboration in the UK. And we're ultimately trying to scale this out to the US. So we have a similar level of involvement over in the US. Next slide, please. So how do we do this? So we're coming to America. So we recognize that we have a huge amount of good work done already, and we're going to try and adapt that as much as possible to the US. And as John alluded to, the clauses are drafted. If you look on the website, they're drafted in such a way where there's an explanation and about how you could apply it to your practice area or jurisdiction. But we also recognize there's a sort of gap analysis to be done based on a sort of what TCLP calls a carbon matrix, where we're going to need new clauses based on US jurisdiction. It's not always going to be transferable as easily. So we'll have a sort of new ideation exercise, which TCLP calls a kind of hackathons. So it's a kind of dual approach of adapting what we have and ideating for new clauses based on where we see, where the market is, based on a lot of what Ken spoke about, recognizing what is market, what you can insert into contracts at this point, what will be accepted. The sustainability appendix, Salesforce sometimes a good example of that. That's a perfect example. That is market practice now, and so that's being used a lot. But where can we push it forward, and where can we kind of bring new stuff into transactions? And then on both sort of adapted and new clauses, how do we utilize it as much? How do we get it into practice as much as we can? So that's sort of the approach. Next slide, please. So how do you get involved? We need people at every level in sort of undertaking that initial analysis, in the drafting exercise. There's a peer review exercise, which is a sort of TCLP standard process. The initial draft gets done, then it gets peer reviewed by a sort of practice expert in the jurisdiction on the subject matter. And we also need subject matter experts, something sort of Jillian alluded to. You need people other than lawyers looking at the clauses saying, well, is this workable in the industry? So we've got to engage, people at the commercial level, but also sort of CSOs of businesses to understand where the needs are. So we're trying to kind of gather as much of input as we can within the project, similar to Professor Gerrard's work, in getting people in, figuring out what needs to be done, and having a small team and sort of delegating tasks within that. So that's what we'll be doing as a small team. And the team within the US is probably going to grow a bit, but we're not sort of asking for like 200 lawyers to be getting on calls every other month. They're going to discuss what's doing. We'll be doing various events where we'll be crowdsourcing ideas and kind of figuring out where the priorities are. So yeah, those are the sort of main channels. There's a US Slack channel, which would invite you all to join, and there'll be some events coming up, with ideas focusing on specific jurisdictions and specific practice areas. So, please spread the word. Email us, get involved as to how much, what your area of expertise is, how you think you want to get involved, and we'll be glad to have you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ollie. So I've seen that Hunter has put a couple of really helpful links to how you can get involved with the US adaptations team in the chat, and where you can find some more information about the work of that team. And if you happen to be watching this from somewhere that is not the US, there are other TCLP adaptation teams around the world, and we will happily put you in touch with those if you would like to spend some of your pro bono time and donate it very generously to the project. I'd like to just say a big thank you to all of you for listening to this debate. I think it's been a really sort of helpful first steps in the US to understanding where we are and where we need to get to. And there's clearly a lot that each and every one of you can do after this call, not least join the US adaptations team, but also familiarize yourselves with our clauses, read them, understand them, look at our events page, come along to the events. There is so much that you can do to get yourself up that curve in terms of, this sort of information that the Paolin has talked about. And don't forget, there's also really helpful information on practical law and also LexisNexis. So there's a wealth of data and information there. And we are all here to help you find your way through that sort of upskilling process. So now you've heard the experts, you've had the lowdown on climate contracting. As someone has once said, now it's up to you, New York, New York. So I'd like to just thank all of our panel for an amazing debate here tonight. And thank you so much for your time, all of you. And I look forward to involvement in the project in some shape or form. Thank you so much, everyone.